Listen now, and let your breathing slow. The wind crosses the endless dunes of Kenshi tonight, as it has for thousands upon thousands of nights before. It carries with it the scent of ancient stone, sun-baked earth, and something else, something older, harder to name. Perhaps it is memory itself, carried on particles of sand that were once part of towering walls, grand archways, the foundations of a civilization that dreamed it would last forever. The moon hangs low and amber in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert. In this light, the ruins take on a different character. What appears lifeless and forgotten by day becomes something softer, more contemplative at night. The broken domes catch moonbeams and hold them briefly before releasing them back to the darkness. Somewhere, far off, a night bird calls, a lonely sound, neither sad nor joyful, simply present. This is the world of Kenshi, a world of extremes and contradictions, where beauty and desolation walk hand in hand across the wasteland. And in this world, there once lived a people who built cities that touched the sky, who dreamed of unity and prosperity, who believed they had found the key to eternal harmony. They called themselves the Hivers. Tonight, we will walk together through their story. We will trace the rise and fall of their golden age, feel the warmth of their sun-drenched plazas, and stand in the cool silence of their abandoned halls. There is no need to rush. Let the words wash over you like the desert wind, gentle, persistent, carrying fragments of something vast and unknowable. Close your eyes if you wish. Breathe deeply. Imagine you are standing on a high dune as darkness settles, looking out across a sea of sand toward distant ruins that catch the last rays of dying light. Somewhere out there, beneath centuries of accumulated dust and silence, lies the story of the Hivers. Let us begin. Long before the current age, before the holy nation carved its domain from the desert, before the united cities built their walls of commerce and control, before the Shek raised their stone fortresses in defiance of extinction, there existed a different world. Not a better world necessarily, but a different one. The sands were younger then, or so the stories say. The ruins were cities. The silence was conversation. The origins of the Hivers are shrouded in the kind of mystery that comes not from a lack of records, but from records so ancient and fragmented that truth and legend have long since braided together into something new. Some say they were always here, native to Kenshi's harsh landscape, that they evolved from creatures that learned to thrive in conditions that would break others. Some say they came from elsewhere, from across distant seas that have since dried to salt flats, or from beneath the earth itself, emerging from caverns deep and dark and unknowable. What we do know,
or what the most reliable fragments suggest, is that the Hivers were once unified in ways that other peoples of Kenshi could scarcely imagine. Not unified by conquest or by the sword, but by something deeper, something biological, something written into the very structure of their beings. They thought, in part, as one. Not a hive mind in the absolute sense. They retained individuality, personality, the capacity for disagreement and innovation, but there existed between them a thread of connection, a subtle awareness of the collective that shaped every decision, every creation, every dream. In the earliest days, they were few, small communities clustered around water sources that have long since vanished. They built simple shelters from stone and packed earth, structures that worked with the landscape rather than dominating it. Even then, even in those humble beginnings, you could see the seeds of what they would become. Their buildings had a certain symmetry, a harmony of proportion that spoke to a shared aesthetic sense. They did not merely build for function, they built for beauty, for the pleasure of creation itself. The Hivers of this early age were not warriors, they were not conquerors. They were builders, thinkers, dreamers. They watched the stars wheel overhead through the clear desert nights and wondered at patterns. They studied the behavior of wind over sand and learned to predict storms. They developed a system of agriculture that could coax life from the most reluctant soil, rotating crops in patterns that seemed to anticipate the needs of the earth itself. And slowly, generation by generation, they grew. Their communities expanded. They made contact with other Hiver settlements across the wastes, and where other races might have fought over resources or territory, the Hivers found cooperation natural, almost inevitable. The thread that connected them made trust easier, communication more efficient. A discovery made in one settlement could ripple through the network, improving life for all.
Their first true city rose in a place where 3 ancient rivers had once converged. The rivers were gone by then, reduced to seasonal trickles and dry beds, but the land remembered water. The soil was rich with the sediment of millennia. The Hivers built there, and they called their city Harmony, though that name comes to us translated through many languages, filtered through time, and the sound of the original word in their clicking, melodic tongue is lost to us now. Harmony was not large by later standards. Perhaps 10,000 Hivers called it home at its peak, but it was beautiful. The buildings were constructed of pale stone that seemed to glow in the sunlight, arranged in concentric circles that spiraled outward from a central plaza. In that plaza stood a fountain. Yes, a fountain, real flowing water, precious and celebrated. Hivers would gather there in the long evenings after work, the setting sun painting everything in shades of amber and rose, and they would share stories, songs, ideas. The water would catch the light and scatter it into tiny rainbows, and Hiver children would play at the fountain's edge while their elders discussed philosophy, engineering, art.
It was here, in harmony, that the first great innovations occurred. The Hivers developed a form of architecture that could capture the desert winds and channel them through their buildings, providing cooling during the brutal summer months. They learned to work with a particular type of local clay that, when fired properly, produced ceramics of extraordinary strength and beauty. They began to keep detailed records, not on paper, which was too precious and fragile, but on thin sheets of metal, carefully inscribed with their written language, a flowing script that looked almost like music when you saw it laid out in columns. But perhaps most importantly, they developed their philosophy. The Hiver philosophy, refined over countless debates in that central plaza, centered on a concept that translates roughly as the pattern. They believed that all things, the stars, the sand, the wind, life itself, were expressions of an underlying pattern, a great design that connected everything. To be Hiver was to be part of that pattern. To build was to honor it. To live harmoniously was to align oneself with the natural flow of existence. They did not worship this pattern as a god. They simply acknowledged it, the way one might acknowledge gravity or the turning of seasons. It was not a matter of faith, but of observation. And in aligning themselves with what they perceived as the pattern's flow, they found a kind of peace that would elude other civilizations for millennia to come. From harmony, the Hiver civilization spread. Other cities rose across the desert, each one unique, yet all unmistakably Hiver in design and spirit. There was resonance, built in a canyon where the wind created haunting harmonies through carved stone. There was nexus, constructed around a rare oasis, its gardens legendary for their beauty. There was clarity, perched on a high plateau, where the thin air and clear skies made it perfect for astronomical observation. And so, in those ancient days, before the great collapse, before the world turned harsh and hostile, the Hivers built their golden age. They did not know it was golden, of course. They simply lived, created, dreamed, and trusted that the pattern would continue to unfold as it always had. Let us move closer now, into the heart of their civilization at its peak, and see what they achieved. Picture a city at dawn. The sun breaks over eastern dunes, painting the sky purple, pink, and gold. The city below, nexus, jewel of Hiver civilization, begins to stir. Streets wide and clean-swept are still cool from night. Buildings with their domed roofs of polished metal and pale stone catch the first light and seem to glow from within. A Hiver worker emerges from their dwelling. Let us call them seeker of patterns. They work in one of the city's foundries, helping produce the metal that becomes everything from cooking vessels to architectural components. They pause at their threshold, antennae moving gently in the morning air, sensing the subtle shifts that tell them what kind of day it will be. The streets of Nexus are a wonder. Every intersection is a small plaza with built-in seating. Every thoroughfare has awnings providing shade during the hottest hours. Buildings are arranged so prevailing winds flow through the city, carrying away heat and bringing freshness. Other hivers emerge: artisans, farmers, teachers, engineers, artists, musicians, poets. The remarkable thing would be the quietness. Not silence, the city is alive with activity, but purposeful calm. Hivers do not shout or jostle, they move with efficiency and grace, communicating in soft clicks and whistles, augmented by antennae movement and subtle body language. To watch them is to watch a kind of dance. At the foundry, work is hot and demanding, but never frantic. There is a rhythm to it. Hivers move between stations seamlessly, each knowing their role, each trusting others to fulfill theirs. There is pride in this work, not individual achievement, but satisfaction of contributing to the pattern, creating things that will serve the community. At midday, work pauses universally. The heat is at its peak, time for rest and reflection. In the shade of pavilions, groups gather to hear storytellers. In quiet courtyards, hivers practice musical arts with instruments of hollowed gourds and stretched membranes. In the libraries, rooms where metal tablets of knowledge are carefully maintained, scholars debate philosophy and share discoveries. Education is central to Hiver society. Every Hiver receives training in broad subjects: reading, writing, calculation, history, practical skills, but also art, music, poetry. The Hivers understand that a person is not just a worker, but a whole being. As afternoon fades to evening, the central plaza fills with life. Merchants set up stands, musicians perform, dancers move through choreographed patterns echoing their philosophies. The fountain at the plaza's center becomes a gathering point for children, while parents watch with contentment. There is a feeling in these evenings hard to describe, not merely happiness, but something deeper. A sense of rightness, of being exactly where one should be, part of something larger and more meaningful than oneself. The feeling of a civilization at peace with itself. Seeker of patterns returns home, shares an evening meal with neighbors, for Hivers often eat communally, then retires. Perhaps they work on a personal project, or simply sit at their window, looking out at the city they helped build, feeling the gentle pulse of connection to their fellow Hivers. And then sleep. Deep, peaceful sleep, knowing tomorrow will bring more of the same. Honest work, good company, beauty, purpose, belonging.
Change comes slowly in the desert. A dune shifts by inches over years. So too did the decline of the Hivers begin, not with catastrophic rupture, but with subtle wrongnesses that at first seemed too small to matter. It began with the water. Nexus and other major cities were built around oases, precious sources of life. For generations, water had flowed reliably, but slowly,
Imperceptibly, the levels began to drop. A gardener noticed a weaker spring flow. An engineer recorded slower refill rates. Committees formed, studies conducted. The conclusion, a natural variation, a periodic dry cycle that would correct itself. The water continued to decline. Trade routes connecting Hiver cities to outlying settlements became less reliable. Bandit activity increased. Some settlements went silent. Caravans found them abandoned, buildings intact but empty, as if inhabitants had simply left one day. No signs of struggle, just absence. This struck at something fundamental in the Hiver psyche. They had always been aware, subtly, of other Hiver communities. Not precisely, but there, a gentle background hum of connection. Now that connection developed dead spots, gaps, silences where there had been presence. Philosophers struggled to explain this. Perhaps the pattern was shifting in ways not yet understood. Perhaps this was a test that would strengthen them. But beneath official reassurances, a new feeling crept into Hiver hearts. Unease, doubt, the first cold whisper of fear. Life continued on the surface. The markets operated, evening gatherings occurred, but gatherings were less attended. Conversations turned more to worries than celebrations. The music seemed somehow more melancholic. Artists created works reflecting this mood. Sculptures with sharper edges, paintings in darker tones, poetry speaking of isolation and separation. The younger generation began asking questions elders found difficult to answer. Why were settlements abandoned? Why was water declining? Why did the philosophy of the pattern suddenly feel inadequate? Some young Hivers traveled to see the abandoned settlements themselves. What they found disturbed them deeply. The ghost towns were eerie, buildings intact and beautiful, but emptiness had changed them. Dust accumulated. The silence was profound. Some travelers reported feeling watched. Others heard whispers on the wind. When these travelers returned and shared their experiences, they were met with denial or dismissal. The older generation did not want to hear troubling reports. To admit something was deeply wrong was to question everything they had built, everything they believed. A gap opened between generations. The young saw decay and wanted urgent action. The old saw temporary difficulty and counseled patience. Meanwhile, agricultural yields declined as decreasing water made irrigation difficult. Food shortages emerged, nothing severe at first, just tighter rationing. Foundries and workshops experienced supply disruptions. Projects that would have taken months now took years. Great architectural ambitions were quietly shelved. Still, the Hivers tried to maintain normalcy. Still, they gathered in evenings, Still, they told themselves this was temporary, that the pattern would reassert itself. But deep down, in places they did not speak of, they were beginning to understand. The golden age was over. Something fundamental had changed, and the worst was yet to come.
3 generations after the first signs of trouble, everything accelerated. The slow accumulation of problems reached critical mass, and decline became collapse. It began with a sickness. The disease had many names: the fading, the hollow, the silence. Its effects were unmistakable. Hivers who contracted it did not sicken traditionally. Instead, they became disconnected. The subtle awareness binding Hiver to Hiver simply disappeared. They could no longer feel the pattern. They were isolated in a way no Hiver had ever been. The psychological effects were devastating. Many affected became deeply depressed, losing interest in work, art, life itself. They would sit for hours, antennae drooping, staring at nothing. Some recovered, but were never the same, haunted, sad. Others never recovered. Then physical symptoms would begin: weakness, difficulty coordinating movement, progressive decline. Within months, many would die quietly, as if deciding life without connection was not worth living. The disease spread slowly but inexorably along old trade routes. The population of Hiver cities began to decline. Nexus, which had housed nearly 100,000 at its peak, fell to 70,000, then 50, then 30. Entire districts stood empty. The city's sound changed. The gentle hum of activity grew intermittent, punctuated by long silences. The psychological impact was worse than the physical reality. The more the collective shrank, the more each individual felt the loss. It became a cycle of despair. The sickness weakened the collective, making individuals more vulnerable, which further weakened the collective. Leadership struggled. Councils that once debated philosophy now managed decline, rationing resources, trying to maintain essential services with dwindling workforce. They made unthinkable decisions, closing city sections to consolidate population, restricting water access, instituting mandatory work assignments. Each decision felt like a betrayal of core Hiver values. Some refused to accept decline. They formed groups seeking solutions, researchers studying the disease, engineers developing new water sources, diplomats reaching out to other civilizations. But these efforts produced few results. An embassy to a human kingdom was received with barely concealed condescension. The message was clear: the world was moving on without the Hivers. Philosophical debates took on darker tones. Some questioned fundamental assumptions. Had they been wrong about the pattern? Had prosperity been built on nothing more than fortunate circumstances now running out? The old philosophers found themselves unable to provide satisfactory explanations. Some became bitter, Others withdrew. A few abandoned old ways entirely, developing darker philosophies, speaking of meaninglessness and chaos. Meanwhile, a slow exodus began. Hivers, particularly the young, started leaving the great cities in small groups, seeking remote locations where water still flowed and the sickness had not reached. These departures were quiet. Hivers would inform neighbors they were leaving, pack what they could carry, and walk into the desert. The cities grew quieter still. In Nexus, neighborhoods stood empty, doors open, possessions abandoned. Wind blew through vacant streets. The great fountain was shut off to conserve water, its basin drying and cracking under the sun. Foundries operated at partial capacity. Schools closed. Libraries became repositories of an increasingly irrelevant past. Yet even in decline, there were moments of beauty and resistance. Musicians continued performing for audiences numbering dozens rather than hundreds. Artists kept creating, documenting what was happening. Teachers gathered small groups and continued lessons, passing on knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Seeker of patterns stayed. They watched friends leave, felt the growing silence, experienced the sickness themselves, a brief but terrifying period of disconnection that fortunately passed. They continued going to the foundry, though the work was less demanding, less purposeful. In evenings, they would walk to the city's edge and look across the desert toward the setting sun, seeing not a home, but something ambiguous. A place that did not care whether Hivers thrived or vanished. This realization was not bitter. It was simply true, and there was strange peace in accepting it.
The end was not dramatic. There was no final battle, no catastrophic plague, no natural disaster. Instead, there was a gradual fading, a gentle closing, like a long exhalation that never draws another breath. By the time of the final days, Nexus housed fewer than 5,000 Hivers, consolidated into a single district. The rest stood empty. Soaring domes, elegant bridges, planned plazas, monuments to a past that felt increasingly distant. Those who remained were mostly the old, those who remembered the golden age and could not bear to leave. Some younger ones stayed too, caretakers who felt duty to maintain what could be maintained, to bear witness to the ending. They kept essential services running as long as possible. Water was drawn from the failing oasis, carefully rationed. Food produced in small gardens. Life had taken on timeless quality. The urgency of earlier years had given way to quiet acceptance. They knew they were witnessing the end, and rather than fight the inevitable, they chose to make that ending graceful. Evening gatherings continued in the occupied district. Small affairs of 30 or 40 Hivers sitting in comfortable silence. Musicians still played slower songs, filled with long pauses like breathing spaces for memory. A small group dedicated themselves to preserving metal tablets containing their history, organizing and reorganizing records, hoping someday someone might find them and understand what the Hivers had been. They debated what message to leave. Should they explain what happened? Warn others of mistakes? In the end, they decided to leave records as they were. Honest accounts of rise and fall, philosophy and culture, successes and failures. They would present themselves as they had been and trust the truth would speak for itself. As resources dwindled, the council decided not to force anyone to stay. Those who wished to leave were free to go with blessing. Some did, small groups of the youngest and strongest heading toward human settlements or Shek territories. Others simply walked into the wasteland. Those who left were not shunned. The Hivers understood survival was now an individual choice. Seeker of Patterns stayed. To leave would be to abandon not just a city, but themselves. They remained, taking on whatever tasks needed doing, sometimes just sitting with others in shared silence. The water was the final factor. One morning, the oasis spring was dry, just damp earth where water had been the day before. Without water, there could be no city. The remaining Hivers held a final gathering in what had been the central plaza, where the fountain had long gone dry. They met in pre-dawn darkness, waiting for the sun to rise one last time on inhabited Nexus. There were no speeches. They simply stood together, feeling the last threads of connection, honoring what they had been and accepting what they had become. As the sun broke over eastern dunes, painting the golden domes in warm light one final time, they began to disperse. Small groups formed based on where people planned to go. They gathered few possessions, water skins, preserved food, tools, sometimes a cherished memento. Seeker of Patterns joined a group heading west toward the region that would someday be the swamps. There were rumors of water there. As they walked through empty streets for the last time, Seeker of Patterns paused at their old home's threshold. The door stood open. Inside, simple furnishings, unfinished decorative panels. They considered going in, but decided against it. That place belonged to the past. The future lay ahead on the open road. The exodus took several days. Groups left at different times, heading different directions. The last to leave were the record keepers. They stayed an extra day, making sure everything was properly organized and secured, placing markers indicating where important records were stored. Then they too departed, leaving Nexus to silence. The city did not die dramatically. It simply became empty. Wind blew through vacant streets. Sand began accumulating. The great domes, no longer maintained, began slow decay that would take centuries. The buildings stood as monuments to absence, beautiful and useless, waiting for time to reduce them to rubble. Other Hiver cities followed similar patterns. Some lasted longer, others fell sooner. But eventually all emptied, all fell silent. The civilization that believed itself aligned with existence's fundamental pattern simply faded away. Some Hivers survived by integrating into other societies. Workers in human cities, soldiers in Shek armies, wanderers and traders. They retained fragments of their culture, but the great collective was broken beyond repair. They were individuals now, separate, alone in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. Seeker of Patterns group reached the swamps, found water and strange plants. They tried building a small settlement, recreating what they'd lost. But it was hard without numbers, resources, certainty. Eventually, the group fragmented further. Seeker of Patterns stayed, found work helping human traders, lived out their years in quiet peace. They never forgot Nexus, never stopped feeling disconnection's ache, but learned to live with it. And in time, they died. One more Hiver who had witnessed their civilization's end and carried its memory into whatever came after.
Centuries pass in the blink of an eye when there are no observers. The ruins of Hiver cities stood beneath sun and stars, slowly transforming from inhabited places to artifacts, to geological features. Wind and sand, heat and cold, the patient work of entropy. A traveler crossing the desert might come upon Nexus without knowing what they'd found. From distance, strange formations on the horizon, domes and towers that could almost be natural rock formations, except for their too regular shapes, their too purposeful arrangement. Approaching closer, truth becomes evident. These are buildings of incredible sophistication, slowly returning to Earth. Walls still stand, weathered and cracked. Domes still soar, though some have partially collapsed. Streets can still be traced, though sand has drifted across them. Walking through these ruins is eerie. The silence is profound, not merely absence of sound, but something deeper, stillness that resists disturbance. The architectural achievements remain evident even in decay. Buildings constructed with such skill that many remain structurally sound despite centuries of neglect. Inside, traces of lives lived here remain: pottery shards, corroded metal tools, metal tablets in libraries, some still legible, fragments of furniture, decorative panels with flowing patterns visible, personal belongings abandoned in final exodus. These artifacts tell stories. A child's toy speaks of ordinary life and play. A half-finished sculpture suggests an artist unable or unwilling to stay. Organized libraries indicate careful preservation for whoever might come after. Nomads passing through sometimes shelter in ruins, finding ancient buildings still provide good protection. They light fires in plazas that once hosted thousands. They rarely stay long. Something about these places makes people uncomfortable. A sense of being watched by absent eyes, of trespassing on ground that still belongs to those who are gone. Stories accumulate. Different peoples interpret through their own lenses. Some humans claim Hivers were destroyed by divine judgment for their pride. Shek warriors tell tales of a weak people who couldn't adapt, using ruins as object lessons about strength's importance. A few scholars study carefully, documenting artifacts, translating surviving tablets, finding accounts touching in their honesty and self-awareness.
personal records are particularly haunting. Individual accounts like journals revealing the emotional landscape of decline, expressions of grief over lost connections, confusion about the pattern's failure, determination to maintain dignity despite despair. One record, possibly from someone like Seeker of Patterns, ends simply, "I have lived according to the pattern as I understood it. If I was wrong, then I was wrong honestly. If I was right, then the wrongness lies elsewhere. Either way, I have done what I could." The ruins also contain mysteries. In several cities, excavators found chambers deep beneath the surface with artifacts that don't match known Hiver aesthetic, more angular, more aggressive, suggesting either an earlier period or contact with another culture. Some speculate these might be remnants of whatever gave Hivers their collective connection. The ruins stand as memorials to a lost possibility, a civilization that tried building something different, seeking harmony rather than domination, cooperation rather than competition. They failed ultimately, but their failure was not ignoble. On certain nights, when wind blows just right through empty streets, travelers report hearing sounds, not voices exactly, but echoes of voices, clicks, whistles, suggestions of distant conversation. Rational minds attribute this to wind through architectural features. Others believe they're hearing ghosts, not malevolent spirits, but simply memories impressed so deeply into stone and sand that they play back spontaneously. Whether ghosts or acoustics, the effect is the same, a reminder that absence is never quite complete, that what was lost is never entirely gone.
To speak of legacy is to ask what remains when everything else has fallen away. The most obvious legacy is architectural. Techniques the Hivers developed for building in the desert, particularly domed structures and wind capture systems, have influenced later civilizations, though often indirectly. Human architects who studied ruins brought back ideas incorporated into their own designs. The way certain buildings in the United Cities manage heat owes something to Hiver innovations, though few current inhabitants realize this. The ruins themselves have become landmarks. 3 days west of the Hiver city appears in many travelers' journals and trade route descriptions. The ruins anchor mental maps of Kenshi, providing orientation in a landscape that can seem featureless. Some ruins have been partially repurposed. Bandits use them as bases. Traders set up temporary markets in old plazas. Religious hermits take residence in abandoned buildings. These secondary uses represent a kind of continuity. The spaces they created still shelter life, still participate in Kenshi's ongoing story. Hiver artifacts are highly prized by collectors. The flowing script on metal tablets is considered beautiful even by those who cannot read it. Museums display Hiver artifacts, though explanatory texts contain more speculation than fact. Some artifacts have taken on quasi-religious significance in certain human cults.
The metal tablets containing Hiver philosophical and technical writings represent perhaps their most important intellectual legacy. Scholars who've translated portions report finding relevant insights. Hiver mathematics, particularly work with geometric patterns, was sophisticated. Their astronomical observations, recorded over centuries, provide valuable data. But it is their philosophy that has proven most intriguing. The concept of the pattern, that all things are expressions of underlying order that can be perceived and aligned with, has influenced various schools of thought in modern Kenshi. The debate continues. Did they fail because their philosophy was flawed, or despite having the right philosophy? Was their collapse proof the pattern doesn't exist, or evidence they lost alignment with it? Some modern Hivers, descendants of survivors who integrated into other societies, maintained they can still feel echoes of the old connection, describing it as a vague sense of something missing, a phantom limb of consciousness. The legacy is also cautionary. Multiple civilizations have looked at Hiver ruins and seen warnings. The Holy Nation points to them as evidence of what happens when civilizations lose divine favor. The United Cities see examples of adaptation failure. The Shek view them as lessons in strength's importance. Perhaps the deepest legacy is emotional and imaginative. The story of the Hivers, a civilization that rose high and fell completely, touches something in the heart. It reminds us nothing lasts forever, that even the greatest achievements turn to dust. But it also reminds us this doesn't make beauty or meaning or effort futile. The Hivers lived, created, loved, thought, built, and dreamed. Their civilization ended, but it was real while it lasted. The joy they experienced was genuine. The beauty they created was true. The connections they felt were meaningful, regardless of how long they persisted. The wind continues blowing across ruins. Sand continues accumulating. Domes continue their slow collapse. Yet something persists, not physical, not measurable, but real. The Hivers are gone, but not forgotten. Their cities are empty, but not meaningless. Their civilization has ended, but continues to echo, faintly, in spaces between what is and what was.
And so we come to the end of our journey through time and memory, dear listener. The night has deepened while we spoke. The moon has traced its arc across the sky and is now settling toward the western horizon. The desert lies quiet under starlight, vast and patient and indifferent in the way that only truly ancient things can be indifferent. Imagine yourself now standing on a high dune overlooking the ruins of Nexus. The moon casts everything in silver and shadow. The domes rise from the sand like the bones of some vast creature long since turned to stone. The streets trace patterns that might be script in a language no one reads anymore. The wind moves through empty windows, creating sounds that could be music or could simply be air finding its way through architectural spaces designed for purposes we can only partially comprehend. There is a peace to be found in places like this, not the peace of resolution or understanding, but the peace of acceptance.
the peace that comes from acknowledging that all things end, all civilizations fall, all dreams eventually wake. And yet we dream anyway. We build anyway. We love and hope and strive anyway, knowing that nothing lasts forever, knowing that the sand will eventually cover everything we create. The Hivers knew this, especially in their final years. They saw their civilization ending, and rather than rage against it or deny it, they chose grace. They maintained their dignity. They preserved their knowledge for whoever might come after. They left their cities with sadness, but without bitterness. They understood something that many never learn, that endings are not failures. They are simply part of the pattern, the natural completion of cycles that must complete. Let your breathing slow. Let your body relax into whatever surface supports it. Feel the weight of your limbs, the gentle rhythm of your heart, the easy flow of air in and out of your lungs. In the desert night, a wind rises. It moves across the dunes, stirring sand into brief swirling clouds that catch the moonlight and glow like ghosts before settling again. It flows through the streets of Nexus, through doorways that once welcomed thousands, past fountains that once flowed with precious water, across plazas where Hivers once gathered to share their days and their dreams. The wind carries no messages, holds no secrets. It is simply wind doing what wind does, moving from high pressure to low pressure, from one temperature zone to another, eternal and mindless and beautiful. And yet, if you listen carefully enough, with ears attuned to imagination rather than literal sound, you might hear in that wind something like whispers, fragments of conversation in a language you don't understand, the echo of music played on instruments that no longer exist, the suggestion of laughter, of community, of connection. These are not ghosts, or perhaps they are, but not the kind that haunt. They are simply memories held in stone and sand, in the curves of architecture and the flow of air, in the patterns that persist long after their makers are gone. They remind us that presence leaves traces, that existence matters, that even when everything else is lost, something remains. Let yourself drift now. Let your mind wander through the streets of imagined cities, beneath domes that catch starlight, across plazas where fountains once played. Let yourself be a hiver in the golden age, feeling the gentle pulse of connection to thousands of others, knowing your place in the pattern, at peace with the world and your place in it. Or let yourself be a traveler in the ruins centuries later, discovering traces of what was, piecing together stories from fragments, feeling the weight of time and the persistence of beauty even in decay. Or simply let yourself be here, now, in this moment, breathing quietly, at rest, held by the same vast patterns that held the Hivers, that hold all of us, that will continue long after we are gone. The moon sets. The stars wheel overhead. The desert sleeps its ancient sleep, dreaming stone dreams, sand dreams, dreams of wind and time and the slow, patient work of entropy. And you sleep too, gently, peacefully, held by the darkness, connected to everything that was and everything that will be, a small part of a vast pattern that neither begins nor ends, but simply is. Rest now. The wind knows the way. The sand remembers. The pattern continues. Sleep.